Hello, guys. This night we start with a topic a touch much less philosophical and lots more greasy. Medieval junk meals. Sure, even in an international without rapid food chains, vending machines, or hot dog carts, humans still observed approaches to snack. And allow me tell you, a number of it became delicious. A number of it becomes stressful. All of it was deeply medieval. So before you get comfortable, take a second to just like the video and subscribe. But best in case, you truly revel in what I do right here. And let me realize inside the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it's miles for you. It is constantly charming to peer who is becoming a member of us from round the world. Now dim the lighting, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft heritage hum, and permits ease into tonight's journey collectively. In a global in which most snacks regarded suspicious and tasted worse, apple fritters were a rare win. Sweet, hot, and barely risky, much like every desirable medieval selection. These golden little pucks had been the closest aspect to a medieval donut, minus the frosting and meals protection requirements. So, what exactly went into a fritter lower back then? Apples glaringly, however now not the vibrant, polished supermarket kind. Think small, tart, knobbly things that grew behind the ale residence, and can or may not have been stolen from a neighbor's tree. They were chopped up, tossed in a rough batter of flour, eggs, and on occasion ale because water was always a raffle, and ale made everything feel slightly greater pleased. Then came the fry. Deep frying in the 1300s become a unique kind of drama. The oil, generally pig fats, changed into reused till it can probable vote. It delivered taste, that's a beneficent word for it. However, the result becomes something hot, crispy, and oddly addictive. A fritter sparkling out of the pan became a touch piece of pleasure. Crispy edges, smooth middle, and a faint threat of third-degree burns. If you have been lucky and wealthy, it is probably dusted with imported sugar, a luxury that doubled as a social flex. For everybody else, a drizzle of honey or spiced syrup did the trick. Either way, it was candy enough to distract you from the rest of your food plan, which in most cases worried cabbage pretending to be different things. Fritters were avenue food. You would clutch one at a fair, after church, or on market days when you wanted a treat and did not thoughts grease in your tunic. Kids loved them. Adults cherished them. Birds attempted to scouse borrow them. They had been amusing, speedy, and just indulgent enough to make you overlook approximately the pickled turnips waiting at home. And yes, sometimes they had been overcooked, or the apples had been extra sour than candy, or the batter became suspiciously chewy. However, after they had been correct, they have been really correct. One chew in, and suddenly you understood why humans placed up with medieval lifestyles. If apple fritters had been the medieval model of a donut, then cheese curds were properly form of the medieval popcorn. Chew-sized, barely squeaky, and wildly inconsistent. They were not flashy. They didn't melt. They did not stretch. In fact, they barely did anything at all. And that's what made them perfect. Let's be clean. Medieval cheese wasn't aiming for Instagram glory. It was made speedy, eaten quicker, and anticipated to live to tell the tale lengthy journeys, questionable garage, and the occasional goat stepping on it. Cheese curds have been essentially infant cheese. The early fresh bits before the wheel hardened into something that could double as a constructing cloth. These little clumps of dairy pleasure had been a byproduct of the cheese procedure. Farmers might separate milk into curds and weigh using rennet, which sounds fancy till you realize it got here from the stomach lining of a child animal. However high it labored. The curds have been pressed, gently salted, after which that become it. And cheese curds. From time to time they were soft, from time to time rubbery. On occasion they squeaked in your teeth like they'd a persona. However, they have been filling, transportable, and weirdly pleasurable. And in a time where snack generally supposed antique bread or bloodless broth, curds felt like a win. Priests cherished them. Vacationers packed them. Kids could eat them like sweet, assuming the cows were cooperative that week. You may fry them, fall apart them over stews, or just consume them by the handful at the same time as pretending no longer to odor like the inside of a barn. Unlike many medieval meals, cheese curds failed to require a party or ceremonial dinner. They were not saved for vacations or saints' days. They had been simply there, comforting, acquainted, mildly chewy. The friend who constantly shows up in no way overperforms, however, is weirdly dependable whilst everything else falls aside. Did they on occasion flavor a bit off? Sure, freshness turned into a spectrum within the middle a long time. However, with enough salt and exuberance, most of the people failed to whinge. Except in a global without refrigeration, your requirements obviously regulate, so no, cheese curds weren't glamorous, but they have been easy, hearty, and just indulgent enough to count number as a deal with. In a pinch, they had been also excellent for bribing cats and small kids. Turnips aren't dessert. Permits simply start there. However, in the medieval world, wherein sugar was expensive, apples were not usually in season, and innovative desperation become a major meals institution. Someone somewhere checked out a turnip and notion, what if this have been pie? And so the turnip pie become born. Now, to be truthful, it wasn't continually lousy. Every so often it changed into even kind of excellent. Think mashed turnips, hopefully smooth, mixed with a bit of egg, maybe some honey or dried fruit if the cooked dinner become feeling beneficent. Then baked interior a robust crust fabricated from flour, water, and ambition. The result, pretty fit for human consumption. At Pleasant, it was warm, a little candy, and had that vaguely comforting root vegetable meats pudding vibe. At worst, it tasted like someone had mistaken livestock feed for a baking factor and simply rolled with it. Turnip pies have been popular for two principal motives. Turnips were cheap, and pie crust may want to cover a mess of sins. Whether the turnips were overripe, undercooked, or suspiciously bitter, when you baked them right into a pie and introduced a drizzle of honey, It became peasant cuisine with aspirations. Turned into a cheesecake. No, however it tried. And in medieval Europe, a tempting counted for plenty. You'd find these pies at fairs, dinner party tables, and in particularly enthusiastic monasteries, wherein the priests had a little and excessive amount of time and a variety of more root veggies. Some recipes added spices, nutmeg if the abbey was wealthy, pepper if the cook turned into chaotic. Every now and then, raisins made and look, which most effective pressured human beings further. Nobles did not eat turnip pie until they were slumming it for amusing or pretending to relate to the commonplace folk for political reasons. However, for all and sundry else, it became dessert. Form of greater like an afterthought with pastry. But in spite of its questionable logic, the turnip pie persisted. People preferred it, or at least they did not dislike it sufficient to prevent making it. It turned into cheap, filling, and mildly candy, which for medieval food made it basically progressive. If the medieval world had a comfort meals MVP, it turned into the meat pasty, a handheld pie stuffed with seasoned meat, tucked into a folded crust, and baked till it changed into golden brown or slightly scorched. Essentially, a medieval hot pocket, minus the microwave, and plus a genuine experience of hazard. The splendor of the pasty was its portability. You could eat it on the road, in the fields, or even as looking a public execution, regardless of the day demanded. Wrapped in a thick pastry crust, it stayed heat for some time and protected the contents from dirt, rats, and the occasional peasant sneeze. However, permits communicate approximately that filling. Meat in this example turned into a bendy time period. In case you lived close to a manor or a looking estate, you may get beef, mutton, or venison. Real recognizable meat. If now not, well, alternatives improved dramatically. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog. Something that when had legs or slithered will be diced, and hidden inside pastry with manageable deniability. Spices were frequently used to decorate flavor, or more realistically, to distract you from it. Pepper, sage, and garlic helped, but they couldn't absolutely hide the reality that the meat had been resting for some days longer than it had to have. Nevertheless, in a time while refrigeration became a delusion, and lunch became regularly just bread and onions, a meaty pasty felt indulgent. There have been even vegetarian versions filled with root greens, leeks, or cheese for fasting days or the specially devout. However, make no mistake, the meat ones were the group pleasers. They had been greasy, warm, and comforting. You didn't ask what become inside. You simply ate it, and was hopping the cooked dinner have been in an excellent mood. And in case you're questioning, sure. Human beings from time to time marked the crust with initials or symbols to say possession, specifically among miners and workers. In some places, the crust changed into more thick along one area, so it could be held with dirty palms and then tossed to the spirits, or greater realistically to rats. So have been they appropriate. Often sure. Had been they mysterious. Always. But that changed into a part of the attraction. You did not devour a meat pasty to sense safe. You ate it because it tasted correct, and you were ready to just accept the effects. In a global in which brushing your tooth intended rinsing with wine, and hopping for the great, candied fennel seeds were the closest component medieval folks needed to breathe mints. Tiny, sugary, and vaguely natural, they have been component deal with, component digestive resource, and component dental risk, all wrapped up in a single, oddly pleasing crunch. Those little seeds were typically covered in a hard shell of sugar, which turned into no small feat. Inside the middle a long time, sugar needed to be imported, boiled, crushed, and poured by using hand, which means a person someplace without a doubt believed within the potential of those tiny snacks. They had been mainly famous in noble households, where guests is probably surpassed a small dish of them after dinner to freshen the mouth, and in all likelihood to distract from the mutton, nevertheless clinging to their nerves. Taste sensible, fennel seed had a sturdy licorice-like chunk. You both loved them, or with courtesy, swallowed them complete, and nodded in gratitude. The sugar coating helped, but there has been constantly that unmistakable natural kick, the type of component that makes you experience both fancy and slightly confused. Candied seeds also had an activity to do, digestion. People believed fennel helped settle the belly, especially after a heavy meal involving 3 sorts of chook and an alarming quantity of mead. Consider them as the medieval version of chewing gum crossed with Tums, but with extra ability to chip a enamel. And yes, they were difficult. Like crack your mur if you're too assured. Tough. You did not bite candied fennel seeds casually. You examined one first, gently bit down, slowly listened for cracking sounds, then devoted. It changed into a risk-reward situation on every occasion. At the same time as the wealthy popped them like medieval tic-tacs, commonplace folks on occasion were given their hands on knockoff versions, typically concerning honey, crushed herbs, and indistinct optimism. Now not quite the equal, but exact enough to pretend. In the grand lineup of medieval junk meals, candied fennel seeds were small, however potent. They did not fill your stomach, however they left a pleasant flavor for your mouth and gave the illusion of refinement. Even in case you have been blanketed in dust and nevertheless had goose grease for your tunic. If medieval cakes had a golden infant, it become the honey cake. Sweet, dense, and vulnerable to sticking to the whole thing except your expectations. Honey cakes had been what took place when bakers got ambitious, and sugar changed into still locked in a fortress treasury. Honey changed into the sweetener of the humans. Assuming those human beings had bees, get entry to bees, or weren't scared of climbing trees and getting stung inside the face. Those cakes were usually made with flour, water, and beneficent spoonfuls of honey. Or at the least, what exceeded for spoonfuls in a generation, wherein spoons were in the main used to combat off siblings. The result, a firm, chewy slab that might either be a satisfying snack or a makeshift doorway stop, relying on how lengthy it had been sitting close to the fire. Spices were now and again brought if the family became feeling rich or showing off. Nutmeg, cloves, or cinnamon ought to give the honey cake a chunk of flair. And through flair, we mean the capacity to cause an entire village to speak about your recipe for a week. Dried culmination have been additionally tossed in the event that they hadn't been stolen via the nearby youngsters or changed into wine. Honey desserts had been famous at feasts, fairs, and weddings, basically due to the fact they could be made ahead of time, didn't ruin quick, and could continue to exist being dropped at the floor, stepped on, or thrown at a person in a slight meals combat. They have been extensively utilized as presents, bribes, and every so often passive competitive statements. Here, I made this for you. It is candy, not like your persona. Structurally, they weren't what you'll call sensitive. Many resembled compact bricks. Slicing them required a sturdy knife, and the quiet wish that no one changed into watching you warfare. Eating them changed into less difficult. Just do not count on a fluffy chew. Those desserts had been constructed for medieval lifestyles. Tough, durable, and coated in sufficient sticky honey to make your palms sense like you lost a war with a beehive. However, they were pleasant. They tasted like warm temperature and indulgence, just like the uncommon second you weren't chewing salted barley or chasing rats out of your cupboard. They have been joy wrapped in sugar, with simply enough bite to matter as aerobic. Fried fish pores and skin cracklings, possibly the maximum pleasant snack to emerge from a subculture that still notion eel pie was an awesome idea. These crispy, salty little strips were not glamorous, however they were efficient. Waste not, need now not, specifically when you're working with a fish that frankly smells like it's judging you. Let's be sincere, no person got down to invent this. More likely, a few thrifty cook changed into left staring at a pile of discarded fish skins and notion, what if we simply fried it? A touch of hot fat later and records changed into made, or at least something vaguely safe to eat was born. Fish skin became abundant, particularly in coastal towns or near rivers where herring, cod, or something were pulled out of the water turned into processed on website online. The meat went to the stew pot, the heads went to the cat, and the pores and skin that got thrown into a pan of bubbling oil and sizzled into submission. The result became enormously addictive. A thin, crispy snack that crunched like a dried leaf, but tasted like focused ocean. A pinch of salt extended the enjoy. A hint of garlic or herbs. Well, now you have been flirting with culinary excellence. Those cracklings were not just tasty. They were sensible, lightweight, non-perishable-ish, and excessive in fats. Exactly what a medieval frame craved after a day of hauling firewood or protecting sheep from someone else's sheep. Squatties packed them. Sailors lived off them. Peasants sold them outside taverns for a few cash. And the pride of feeding inebriated human beings, something louder than their verbal exchange. Did they now and again still have scales? Sure. Did they now and again curl into bizarre shapes that made you query your existence alternatives? Additionally, yes. But by using medieval standards, they had been downright elegant, crispy, flavorful, and not going to offer you dysentery. The handiest actual drawback scent. These items may want to announce their presence from 3 huts away. In case you fried a batch interior, your home would odor like Poseidon's laundry for a stable week. However, you would be forgiven due to the fact they tasted right. When lifestyles gave you stale bread and warm beer, you did not cry. You made the most medieval snack imaginable. Bread soaked in ale. Recognized variously as soups or trench toast, this humble introduction was the authentic consolation meals. Assume French toast, however without the eggs, sugar, cinnamon, or pleasure. Here's the way it labored. You took the previous day's bread, the kind that could double as constructing fabric, and dunked it right into a bowl of ale. Not fancy craft ale with notes of citrus and a hoppy end. No, this became flat, low-alcohol medieval ale brewed in someone's smoky-again room, with the hygiene requirements of a barn owl. The bread absorbed the ale like a sponge with trust issues. It softened, swelled, and transformed from a jawbreaker into something vaguely safe to eat. Became it tasty inside the proper light, with an amazing mood and coffee expectancies? Yes, sort of. It become heat, bready, and carried the mild bitterness of fermented grain, which is to mention it didn't actively offend the palate. This snack was specifically popular with the working elegants, those who didn't have time for a couple of courses or cutlery, however nonetheless needed calories that would not combat back. Bread soaked in ale turned into brief, hearty, and just messy sufficient to experience like a real damage out of your day-by-day chores. From time to time, humans brought extras, a sprinkle of herbs, a bit of cheese, or a fried egg if the hen felt generous that morning. On feast days, you might even get soap soaked in spiced ale, which essentially intended the prepared dinner located a nutmeg shaving someplace and were given stimulated. And like many medieval dishes, this one had twin cause. Now not most effective turned into it food, it was also a way to stretch components. Bread too stale to chunk. Simply soak it. Ale beginning to show. Pour it on bread and faux it's intentional. Waste turned into for amateurs. The most effective disadvantage, it didn't travel well. Once soaked, the bread was a sort of sloshy porridge dice. Devour it speedy or chance ending up with a delicate sponge for your bowl, and 1,000-year vintage meals metaphor for unhappiness. Still, for a cold nighttime with the aid of the fireplace, nothing beat a slice of old bread mush and a second of peace. In case you've ever looked at a slice of bread and notion, this would be better submerged in alcohol, congratulations. You and the medieval upper elegance have something in commonplace. Sops and wine were one of the more refined, examined, bizarrely unique snacks of the Center Ages. A dessert technically, or possibly in revel in. The concept became simple. Take bread, preferably toasted, or at least no longer completely stale, and dunk it in wine. No longer just any wine, of course, normally mulled, sweetened, or spiced wine. Something heat, aromatic, and slightly hiding the reality that it were sitting in a clay jug on the grounds that last harvest. As soon as the bread becomes sufficiently drenched, it was served as a tender, spoonable delicacy. Nobles known as it elegant. Anyone else quietly wondered if the cooked dinner had simply run out of thoughts. This turned into not finger meals. It changed into the type of dish you ate with a spoon, very slowly, even as pretending to be interested in loot track. It appeared at banquets, past due nighttime feasts, and the form of awkward dinner in which no person desired to speak approximately politics. So rather they surpassed round, soggy toast in a goblet. While carried out properly, soaps and wine had been heat, comforting and mildly intoxicating, a gentle stop to a heavy meal. The wine delivered richness, the bread gave texture, and the spices made you feel such as you have been a part of something fancier than it was. While executed poorly, it turned into wet bread in a bowl. No quantity of cinnamon could cowle up the sensation which you had been chewing on a medieval mistake. Every so often dried culmination or nuts have been introduced for flair, occasionally cheese, every now and then an entire egg. At that factor, it stopped being a snack and became a culinary guessing sport. Peasants made their own versions, generally using reasonably priced vinegar or ale in preference to wine. It wasn't dessert. It was dinner or breakfast, or anything you may call a meal that made you both full and burdened. Nonetheless, soaps and wine had staying strength. They were warm. They had been filling, and that they gave medieval human beings a taste of indulgence, despite the fact that it did taste like sponge soaked in mildew remorse. Inside the center a while, dried fruit became a prized treat. Sugary, unusual, and shelf-stable sufficient to continue to exist an entire campaign. However, let's be clean. This wasn't your modern-day trail blend with lovable, reelable packaging. Medieval dried fruit had one job to closing. Taste changed into optional. Texture aggressively chewy. Dental damage almost a sure. Allows start with the fundamentals. You had your normal suspects, raisins, figs, dates, and if you were really fancy, imported prunes. Those have been culmination that had been sundried, smoked, dried, or in some cases, just forgotten on a window sill till they now not certified as wet. They were wrinkled, tough, and alarmingly dense. Sort of like in fit for human consumption time tablet from Ultimate Harvest. The upside, dried fruit turned into sweet. Simply candy. Concentrated sugars became these contracted little matters into medieval candy. Nobles loved them. Monks hoarded them. And kids handled them like uncommon loot from the kitchen. The drawback. Chewing them become like combating your own jaw muscle groups. Figs came with seeds that doubled as medieval dental floss. Dates have been sticky sufficient to attach your murs together. Raisins stuck on your enamel for hours. There has been no such aspect as snacking quietly. Still, dried fruit had its moments. It became used in pies, brought to porridge, or chopped up and thrown into honey cakes to create the illusion of range. Rich oldsters would possibly wrap them in pastry, drizzle them with rose water, or soak them in wine like they had been trying to affect a guest from Florence. For commoners, getting your arms on dried fruit changed into a unique event. Normally a vacation, a marriage, or the one day or someone remembered you existed. Whilst that befell, you'd consume it slowly, respectfully, probable even as hiding inside the barn so that you didn't ought to percentage. Garage becomes smooth. Dried fruit did not ruin quickly and turned into frequently kept in little material sacks or clay pots. It hardened over time, yes, but that simply grew to become it right into a longer-lasting snack, or in all likelihood a projectile, in case you had been creative and had younger siblings. In short, dried fruit becomes sweet, steeply priced, and faintly dangerous. It stuck with you, sometimes actually. You wake up hungry. You need something hearty, something fried, something that could bite again. Input the blood pudding ball, a medieval snack so dense, so ambitious, so unapologetically iron-rich. It makes modern sausage rolls appear like timid breadsticks. Born out of the noble subculture of the usage of each part of the animal, those savory spheres have been evidence that waste not, need not, even if what you are not losing is blood. Let's unpack it. First, you collect clean animal blood. Usually pig, though virtually any blood could do in a pinch. You then mix it with oats, onions, stitch it. It is red meat, fats, and spices. Once that morbid porridge reaches simply the right stage of grim stickiness, you shape it into balls and fry them in sizzling fat till the out-of-doors crisps up like it has something to show. The result, darkish, crispy orbs of protein-packed sustenance with a wealthy, earthy taste. That is code for you'll taste iron and mystery for the relaxation of the day. They were nice served hot, fresh from the skillet, although once in a while they have been eaten bloodless in case your urge for food outweighed your fear of congealed fats. Nobles might dress them up with pepper, or serve them with eggs and ale. Peasants, they had been simply happy not to be chewing on boiled cabbage once more. Blood-pudding balls were not elegant, but they had been sensible, easy to carry, high in calories and alarmingly filling. In case you ate, you can skip lunch. In case you ate 4, you had been in all likelihood a blacksmith or trying to win a dare. These snacks were not unusual at fairs, markets, and roadside stalls, where the whole lot smelled like cattle and ambition. They had been mainly popular in colder months, due to the fact what warms the soul like fried coagulation. Of direction, blood pudding balls were not for all people. A few parents failed to love the feel. Others failed to love the concept. But in a world where survival got here first, and flavor got here somewhere around 12th, these meaty little morsels earned their vicinity inside the medieval junk food hall of reputation. Neglect the entirety, you already know approximately pancakes. These were not fluffy stacks with maple syrup and whipped cream. Medieval pancakes were thinner, more difficult, and cooked in sufficient lard to make your arteries keep in mind early retirement. However, they were given the activity accomplished. And in an international wherein your other breakfast choice turned into skinny soup that's sad about its existence, they have been kind of a treat. Made from a humble mix of flour, eggs, and water or ale, those pancakes had been poured onto a scorching iron griddle coated in bubbling pig fat. No non-stick pans, no element manage. You just ladled and was hopping. The result, a flat, choppy circle with crispy browned edges and a slightly chewy center. The sort of pancake that would live to tell the tale a horseback experience, and nevertheless be commonly edible whilst you arrived. Every so often it become a touch burnt, every now and then it become a little uncooked, once in a while charmingly. Both. Flavor relied on what you had. A dash of ale added a pleasant tang. A spoonful of honey high-priced. A sprinkle of herbs or onions, adventurous. However, most of the time it became just pancake and grease. Served warm and inhaled like you simply run from a tax collector. These pancakes were democratic. Every person ate them. Peasants, nobles, priests, merchants. Some layered them with cheese. Some dunked them in broth, and others simply rolled them up and known as it a day. You may eat them sweet, savory, or scorched beyond recognition. And if you had leftovers, stack them up and pretend they had been cake or armor. They have been particularly popular in the course of Lent and different fasting days, when meat was off limits. Pancakes have become a loophole, fried, filling, and by hook or by crook both humble and indulgent. Plus, they made first-rate vessels for disguising other components that had no enterprise being in your mouth. And at the same time as they may not have been lovely, medieval pancakes had staying electricity. They failed to need reward. They just wanted a warm pan and a willing belly. Someplace between a snack and a sacrament, we discover the medieval wafer. A skinny, crisp, suspiciously mild biscuit that danced the road among dessert and dental venture. Wafers were everywhere. Outdoor churches, at village galas in the palms of priests, and now and again floating on your soup like a flat holy crouton. Allows make clear. We're no longer speak me about chocolate-dipped cream-filled delights. Medieval wafers were made from flour, water, eggs, and now not lots else. If you were feeling fancy, you may upload a dash of honey or rose water, but most stuck with the fundamentals. Thin batter poured onto hot metallic wafer irons, pressed among two sizzling plates like a medieval panini press. The end result, something that appeared love it belonged in a communion rite and tasted like crispy paper with ambitions. Wafers had been popular because they have been transportable, rapid to make, and pleasant of all. They could be bought in huge quantities for a tidy earnings. Carriers would set up outdoor church buildings on dinner party days, waving stacks of heat wafers at the trustworthy as they left Mass. By now, sin later became not the slogan, but it changed into the overall vibe. They were regularly shaped with non-secular symbols, floral styles, or the indistinct imprint of a saint's face relying on the iron mold, and the way worn out the baker become. These designs failed to beautify the flavor, but they did provide you with something to stare at while chewing thoughtfully and pretending you were not upset. Structurally, wafers were sensitive. They cracked if you checked out them incorrect and shattered if you tried to interrupt them cleanly. Storing them become a project, transporting them even extra so, which made consuming them exterior a excessive stakes affair related to crumbs, wind, and regret. Nonetheless, they have been liked, mild, crispy, and vaguely celebratory. Wafers had been the medieval model of treating yourself, without completely wrecking your digestion or your pockets. For nobles, they came stacked with fruit or layered with smooth cheese. For each person else, they have been bought with the aid of the dozen in avenue stalls, and eaten right now earlier than they disintegrated into edible confetti. Suck it. Even the call sounds sticky. This medieval treat became essentially fruit that had been boiled into submission, drowned in syrup, and sealed in a jar like a sweet little hostage. Suppose candied oranges, dates, or ginger, coated in sufficient sugar to make your tooth tingle, and your judgment of right and wrong whisper, "You shouldn't be ingesting this." But you did, as it became delicious and probably imported, and also you did not have a good deal else. Suck it wasn't for the normal peasant chewing his seventh onion of the week. No, this was elite-tier snacking, the type of indulgence served in noble halls or proficient through the wealthy to say, "I love you, but not sufficient to give you land." Sugar become pricey, and fruits were not always in season, so suck it become reserved for special occasions like weddings or royal visits or Wednesday, if you had been outrageously rich and out of control. The education system became formidable. First, you'd boil the fruit in syrup, maybe honey, perhaps delicate sugar if your spice merchant owed you a want. Then you'll drain it, let it dry a chunk, and repeat several instances, due to the fact as soon as wasn't enough. You weren't simply maintaining fruit. You have been declaring warfare on moisture itself. Finally, the end result become a glossy, jewel-toned bite of sweet, chewy, excessive, and so sweet it can likely be weaponized in huge sufficient doses. Some variations were gentle and syrupy, served in ornate glass jars. Others have been dry, rolled in greater sugar, and handed out as dainty little cubes of medieval hypoglycemia. But make no mistake, suck it came with status. It said you had get right of entry to sugar, alternate routes, and as a minimum one servant committed solely to stirring things that failed to want to be stirred. Suck-it trays have been handed around after banquets like fit to be eaten gold coins. Visitors took one piece, smiled graciously, and right away regretted now not grabbing three. As for commoners, they watched from the kitchen, and perhaps licked a spoon if no one became looking. So changed into it worth it. Clearly sure. Suck it become one of the few medieval snacks that without a doubt felt like dessert. It became wealthy, subtle, and simply extravagant enough to make up for the reality that dinner had blanketed boiled something. Ah, fried eel, the grand finale of medieval junk food. A dish so strangely cherished, it made its manner from peasant hearths to royal banquets without once preventing to invite, "Wait, am I absolutely the satisfactory option here?" Sure. Yes, it became. Eel became anywhere in medieval Europe. Rivers and streams nearly writhed with them, and that they were easy to catch, cheap to cook dinner, and whilst fried, notably crispy, slippery when raw, bonier than predicted, and fashioned just like the villain in a fish-themed horror tale. Eel changed into still eaten by way of the bucket load. Why? As it become tasty, and extra importantly, it wasn't turnips. To put together it, you'd first ought to seize the eel, typically at night time once they slithered through shallow waters like sentient noodles. Then came the ugly project of skinning them, which changed into much less like prepping a fish and more like wrestling a wet rope that didn't want to die. Once subdued, the eels had been chopped, pro in case you had been feeling ambitious, and tossed into warm fat till the skin crisped up and the beef firmed into something vaguely appealing. The finished product, a crunchy, savory chunk with a rich, barely oily taste, like if Catamaran Bird had an identity disaster in a tavern kitchen. Fried eel becomes served at festivals, feasts, roadside inns, and agree with it or not, at some point of non-secular fasts. That is right. Eel wasn't technically meat, so it slipped via the nutritional loopholes like itself. Clergymen ate it. Nobles flaunted it. Kings had it filled into pies and paraded across banquets like the soapent it usually wanted to be. Sure, it had bones, masses of them, and yes, it every so often wriggled lengthy after death. But if you may get beyond that, and the haunting feeling which you had been eating a villain from a cautionary folktale, fried eel was sincerely scrumptious. Crispy pores and skin, soft inside, and simply greasy enough to make you sense like you were dwelling a little too dangerously for a Wednesday afternoon. Today, it might appear bizarre. Again, then, it became a delicacy, a slippery little miracle that stored bellies full and menus bizarre. Within the historic global, Mesopotamia stood at the crossroads of thriller and mythology. And nowhere become this greater evident than in how they regarded goals. To the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, a dream wasn't only a non-public, meaningless experience. It became a divine telegram, a supernatural email sent without delay from the gods to the subconscious. And ignoring it, that became like leaving a message from Enlil unread. Risky. Via around 2500 BCE, Mesopotamians had advanced a complete-blown gadget of dream interpretation, recorded on clay capsules in cune-shaped script. Those were not bedtime novelties. They had been used in statecraft, remedy, and religious rituals. Kings would put off wars if a troubling dream suggested bad omens. Farmers wouldn't plant plants in the event that they noticed a goat fly across the sky of their sleep. The arena, they believed, was continuously speaking. It was your job to pay attention, along with your eyes closed. Expert dream interpreters referred to as Baru clergymen have been the ancient equivalent of Freudian analysts, minus the couch. They were skilled in libraries of omen texts, just like the Ishkar-Zak, and complicated dream manual that labeled goals and their meanings in occasionally absurd but eerily specific methods. Dreaming of consuming dates. Good omen. Dreaming of your enamel falling out. Anticipate dying within the family. Dreaming of sex with a goddess. Properly congrats. You are both divinely desired or cursed with conceitedness. Those dream books did not claim to guess meanings. They offered motive and impact, as if desires had been equations. A equals B. I see a snake. I anticipate betrayal. Fall from a rooftop. A lawsuit is coming. The arena of desires became logical, just operating on divine good judgment, which become a long way stranger than human reason. But the Mesopotamians didn't prevent at interpretation. They practiced dream incubation, too. If a ruler desired steering from the gods, he would possibly sleep in a temple under special instances, fasting, cleansing rituals, possibly a few incense offerings, and await a revelatory dream. The idea changed into that certain environments made the divine connection stronger, clearer, and much less susceptible to nightmares about drunk goats. For Mesopotamians, the dream international became no longer a thriller to clear up. It became a realm to navigate with caution, reverence, and a totally huge clay tablet library. They believed the gods had been always speak me. You just had to be asleep to pay attention them. In historical Egypt, goals were not simply nightly occurrences. They have been taken into consideration sacred texts in movement. The Egyptians believed that desires have been messages from the gods, ancestors, or even from one's personal okay, the non-secular double of someone. Every dream, appropriate or bad, came with cause. It can warn, bless, instruct, or terrify. By the point of the brand new nation, circa 1550-1070 B. C. Lead. The Egyptians had began recording their interpretations in what might end up a number of history's earliest dream manuals. One of the maximum famous examples is the Ramesside Dream ebook written on papyrus and found within the village of Deir el-Medina. This wasn't mild analyzing. It's basically a divine diagnostic tool, list masses of desires and interpreting each based totally on whether or not the final results might be favorable or disastrous. The logic, but become not continually intuitive. For example, if a man sees himself eating crocodile flesh in a dream, it way he will become a high reputable. A strange sure. However, in Egyptian cosmology, the crocodile become tied to the god Sobek, who embodied energy and electricity. Eating crocodile intended absorbing divine traits. It truly is a promotion worth omen. Each entry in the Dream e-book started out with the word, if a man sees himself, observed by using a symbolic situation. Those weren't preferred guesses. They were drawn from centuries of ritual knowledge, private visions, and temple tradition. And the interpretations had been frequently binary, marked as suitable or horrific in crimson and black ink. In case your dream changed into categorized as horrific, it changed into time to mild some incense and beg a clergyman to intervene. Priests in temple complexes, particularly those serving restoration deities like Serket or Thoth, once in a while presented services in dream incubation, where supplicants would sleep inside the temple and look ahead to steerage or recovery via visions. The concept became to open a divine channel through purification, prayer, and managed sleep. This wasn't mere superstition. It became health care, divination, and theology rolled into one night's rest. Dreams also stimulated magic and medicinal drug. Amulets might be prescribed to fend off ordinary nightmares. Precise rituals might be completed to erase a dream, just like you'll erase a curse. For the historical Egyptians, the sound asleep thoughts become not idle. It became a degree wherein gods, demons, and the spirits of the dead could appear and offer glimpses into hidden truths, in case you had the know-how and a priest to decode them. In the historical Greek International, desires have been more than divine whispers. They had been scientific appointments with the gods. Primary to this belief became the exercise of incubation, a ritual where people could sleep inside a temple in hopes of receiving a recovery vision. And no deity changed into greater closely tied to this practice than Asclepius, the god of medicine. At temples acknowledged Aspiera, which dotted the Greek global from Epidaurus to Pergamon. The unwell, the hopeful, and the desperate came in search of treatments. However, rather than capsules or potions, they were prescribed sleep, sacred, intentional, and carried out under particular religious conditions. Before coming into the temple's napping quarters or abaton, a person could undergo purification, bathing, fasting, and sometimes sacrificing an animal. Most effective after those rituals should they lay down on a stone bed and watch for the god to appear in a dream. The effects. In step with inscriptions and historical tales, some sufferers dreamed of Asclepius touching them with his group of workers or of snakes, his sacred animal, slithering over their bodies. They might wake up healed, or at the least consider that they had received divine instructions on what to do subsequent. Whether or not these dreams had been actual, psychosomatic, or placebo-driven, the consequences had been profound. Greek physicians, together with Hippocrates, mentioned the fee of dreams in analysis. They did not disregard them as nonsense. In reality, they believed the body may want to monitor its kingdom via symbolic visions. A dream of flowing water might advocate kidney troubles. A dream of being crushed could factor to a chest disease. In Hippocratic texts, desires were often categorized as either natural or divine. Herbal desires were due to food plan, digestion, or emotional pressure. Divine ones, a whole different category, direct messages from the gods or the cosmos. But no longer all dream interpreters wore white gowns and carried scrolls. The owner recreti, or dream readers, were the actual stars of the general public rectangular. The usage of dream manuals, omens, and incisable deliver of interpretive flair. They translated goals into warnings, advantages, or instructions. The maximum well-known of those courses was the Onerositica written by using Artemiodorus of Daldes in the 2nd century CE. A e-book nevertheless studied centuries later. In Greece, the dream wasn't just a midnight experience. It turned into a bridge among mortal and divine, body and soul, infection and recuperation. And if you were lucky, you'll wake up with a treatment and perhaps a snake curled at your toes. At some stage in the ancient international, one class of dream carried greater weight than all others, the prophetic dream. Those were not simply messages. They had been warnings, revelations, or calls to motion. For cultures spanning Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and beyond, prophetic dreams have been sacred transmissions from a better plane, direct hyperlinks to gods, destiny, or the mysterious mechanisms of the cosmos. Inside the historic Hebrew subculture, prophetic desires have been a recognized and revered channel of divine verbal exchange. The Antique Testament is filled with examples. Think about Joseph, son of Jacob, who dreamt of sheaves of wheat bowing earlier than his personal, an image of his future upward thrust to electricity. Later, as an interpreter of Pharaoh's desires in Egypt, he anticipated 7 years of plenty observed through 7 years of famine. That one dream of cows, fat and thin, altered the root of Egypt's economic system. Joseph didn't simply examine dreams. He had become a countrywide strategist by way of doing so. Likewise, in Mesopotamia, kings frequently acquired desires that foretold victory, catastrophe, or divine prefer. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal claimed he saw the gods in his goals, guiding him to fulfillment in war and governance. Prophetic dreams have been seen as confirmation that a ruler had divine legitimacy, essential in a world where the road among king and deity turned into skinny. The Greeks, too, recognized this prophetic potential. Goals were categorized. The ones from the subconscious had been known as enhypnia. However, those who revealed truth had been known as oniroi alithin. These have been no longer taken gently. Before major selections, founding a metropolis, declaring war, launching a voyage, Greek leaders often consulted dreams or the ones skilled to interpret them. Desires were so revered that they had their very own minor deities, the winged spirits who entered the sleeper's thoughts with messages from the gods. Even the Romans, usually more pragmatic, took prophetic goals critically. The Emperor Augustus changed into said to have dreamt of destiny glory, and even Nero consulted dream interpreters in the course of his reign. Possibly not sufficient considering how that became out. The Roman preferred Scipio Aricanes before defeating Hannibal, reportedly had a dream of victory dispatched by way of the spirits of his ancestors. In historical societies, prophetic desires weren't facet notes. They were equipment of electricity, units of policy, and evidence of divine choice. The fate of countries, the health of empires, and the upward push of legends regularly began with something as easy as a whispered, imaginative, and prescient within the dark. Even as Greek Asclepian temples are the maximum famous, ancient dream incubation changed into now not special to Greece. In Anatolia, cutting-edge day Turkey dream restoration thrived in a rich combo of Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions, with temples and sacred websites dedicated to facilitating contact with divine forces through sleep. The maximum charming instance comes from the cult of Phelos, a Phrygian lunar god related to recovery cycles and clearly goals. His temples frequently sat on hills dealing with the night sky, as though placed to trap lunar messages beamed down into the goals of supplicants. Human beings affected by bodily ailments, religious unrest, or uncertainty about their futures could come to those shrines to exercise incubation, ritual sleep with the hope of receiving a curative or guiding dream. The technique became just like what we noticed in Asclepian practices. However, Anatolian incubation had its very own twists. Worshippers might from time to time walk labyrinth paths or sleep below celestial carvings, believing their proximity to sacred geometry might recognition divine messages. Tune, incense, and chant were often used to tune the sleeper's mind to the divine frequency. This wasn't sleep for rest. It turned into sleep as spiritual reception. Texts from the location also point out dream monks, religious experts skilled to manual and interpret these visions. A few might even seed goals, suggesting imagery or symbols before sleep to form the encounter. For example, a person wanting an imaginative impression of their destiny infant might sleep with a carved fertility idol below their pillow. In the event that they dreamt of a lion, the priest may declare that a brave son changed into at the manor. If they dreamt of rain, a daughter blessed by boom and awareness. Hittite information also referenced divine encounters and desires, especially amongst royalty. Kings and queens obtained strategic advice, recovery knowledge, and occasionally harsh warnings from the gods of their sleep. One dream reportedly informed a queen to adopt a foreign goddess into her shrine, an early instance of divine international relations. Dream incubation in Anatolia wasn't just personal. It became communal and cosmic. Pilgrims traveled lengthy distances, regularly forming transient recuperation groups, sure now not via blood, however with the aid of shared vulnerability and desire. And via sleep, they believed the gods ought to reset the root in their lives. In Anatolia, to dream wasn't passive. It changed into an act of ritual participation, where recuperation and prophecy flowed now not from good judgment, but from the silent language of sleep. With the aid of the 2D century CE, the historic art of dream interpretation had matured right into a disciplined craft. And one guy took it upon himself to systematize all of it. Artodorus of Daldes, a Greek from Asia Minor, Artemodorus wrote the Onere Critica, the most comprehensive and influential dream manual of the historical global. And unlike mystical scribes who veiled the whole thing in divine thriller, Artaudurus approached dreams with the methodical precision of a scholar and the curiosity of a streetwise psychologist. The Oniritica wasn't some mystical pamphlet. It was a 5-book tome written in clear Greek packed with heaps of dream scenarios, and their meanings culled from personal interviews, temple data, and public performances. Artemodorus claimed he spent a long time accumulating dream money owed from humans of all walks of lifestyles: sailors, traders, prostitutes, squatties. His logic: if you need to recognize the soul of a tradition, pay attention to its goals. He organized dreams into classes: actions, animals, professions, physical features, even types of relationships. Dreaming of flying. That would recommend freedom or vanity. Dreaming of being naked in public. Depending on your social elegance, it'd mean shame or destiny power. Dreaming of enamel falling out. That supposed a loss, generally of relatives. That one appears to have stuck via the centuries. However, what makes Artaudurus specific is that he emphasized context. In contrast to in advanced dream books which gave static meanings, Artemodora pressured the significance of the dreamer's fame, gender, profession, and modern-day existence circumstances. A wealthy man dreaming of a shipwreck's supposed enterprise issues. A poor guy dreaming of the identical aspect may find new fortune. Interpretation wasn't one-size-fits-all. It became tailored, nearly like early psychotherapy. Artemodorus also tackled symbolism head-on. He understood that goals used metaphor and irony. A dream of demise did not imply dying. It can mean renewal. A dream of sex did not constantly refer to preference. It'd sign dominance, strength struggles, or guilt. His interpretations walk an unusual line among deeply logical and especially bizarre. The Oniritica wasn't only a curiosity. It became used for hundreds of years throughout the Roman Empire and Byzantine global. It influenced medieval dream interpreters and become translated into Arabic, maintaining the flame alive long after classical temples fell. With Artaudurus, the dream became a textual content to be studied, decoded not only for prophecy, however for insight. He might not have believed desires came from gods. However, he absolutely believed they came from somewhere deep, bizarre, and worth exploring. Now, not all dreams in the historic international were items from the gods. Some were terrors from the depths, darkish, haunting visions believed to return from stressed spirits, demonic forces, or maybe the underworld itself. Those weren't seen as mere awful nights of sleep. They have been warnings, punishments, or omens of things to come. The Babylonians have been most of the first to distinguish goals of divine starting place from those that got here from malevolent forces. If a dream triggered fear, contamination, or misery, it turned into considered polluted, and a priest could be known as to perform apotropic rituals, cleaning spells, services, or symbolic actions designed to neutralize the dream's impact. As an instance, If someone dreamed of being chased with the aid of a demon, the interpreter might suggest napping with a protective amulet below the pillow or burning cedarwood incense to ward off evil spirits. The Egyptians additionally had a nicely developed idea of nightmare prevention. Certain dreams were believed to be resulting from malicious entities, which include the dead. Amulets bearing the Eye of Horus, or pictures of Bez, the dwarf god who blanketed families from dark forces, have been worn to shield against these attacks. Some humans even recited dream-erasing spells upon waking, treating the nightmare as a contagious curse that needed to be spoken out of existence earlier than it could happen inside the physical world. In Greek idea, nightmares often signified a message now not from the Olympians, but from chthonic deities, gods of the earth and the underworld. Hades, Persephone, and even the terrifying Aryan Furies may want to seem in dreams to specific divine displeasure, or signal a criminal offense left unpunished. Dreamers who disregarded these warnings did so at their peril. The philosopher Plato within the Republic even described the dream as a battleground between purpose and urge for food, in which the decreased components of the soul ran wild. For him, the nightmare changed into not only a religious warning, but a psychological one, an indication that your internal self became out of balance. Even the Romans, realistic as ever, feared goals of certain animals, like owls, snakes, or wolves, as signs of coming near death, betrayal, or warfare. They believed the dead should visit the dwelling through dreams, every so often to warn, sometimes to accuse. In every tradition, nightmares had been greater than bad dreams. They have been visible as cosmic crimson flags, reminders that the seen and unseen worlds have been constantly connected, and that even in sleep, there was no authentic escape from destiny. Inside the historic world, dreams weren't just non-secular. They had been political assets. Rulers, priests, generals, and prophets often weaponized dreams to justify decisions, sway public opinion, or consolidate authority. When the gods spoke in sleep, the ones in power have been brief to mention, "They spoke to me." Take Alexander the Excellent, for example. Before he conquered Egypt, he reportedly dreamed of the god Ammon welcoming him as a son. Upon arrival on the Saywa oasis, the local oracle confirmed the dream, asserting Alexander a divine offspring. Became the dream actual? Turned into it staged? It failed to be counted. The message solidified his rule and painted him as extra than mortal, a dwelling god in the eyes of his troops and subjects. Goals have been in particular beneficial all through political transitions or uncertain instances. In ancient Rome, Augustus claimed to have dreamed of a brilliant victory at Actium, which he won towards Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Afterward, this dream was immortalized in literature and cash, turning it into a sacred narrative. Later emperors observed in shape. If the gods supported your dream, who dared oppose your moves? Monks and oracles often performed into this. Dream interpretation became a theological tool, especially when it aligned with the interests of a ruler or temple elite. Think a rebellious governor dreamt of disaster. The priest would possibly interpret it as divine punishment for challenging imperial authority. On the flip facet, goals of fruitfulness and victory, interpreted successfully, ought to embolden leaders to start campaigns, improve taxes, or enact reforms. This wasn't limited to guys. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt claimed in temple inscriptions that her start was foretold in a dream via the god Amun, who regarded to her mother and prophesied divine rulership. By framing her reign as destined in dreams, she bolstered her legitimacy in a male-dominated throne. Prophets in the Hebrew Bible also used goals to mission kings. Daniel, for instance, interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a remarkable statue, forecasting the upward thrust and fall of empires. It wasn't simply dream studying. It became geopolitics wrapped in allegory. In each civilization, dreams allowed leaders to say, "This isn't always simply my will. It smiles the need of heaven." Whether divine revelation or calculated propaganda, goals have been a powerful currency, turning the subconscious into statecraft, one vision at a time. Though the ancient temples have crumbled and the monks of dream now sleep below layers of dirt, the legacy of ancient dream interpretation lives on, whispering through time, science, and psychology. Lots of what we agree with these days about desires, our fascination with symbolism, ordinary motifs, even nightmares, has roots in historical frameworks that attempted to make feel of the sleeping thoughts. The medieval global inherited those traditions wholesale. Islamic pupils translated the Onuro Critica of Artasis into Arabic, refining and expanding on it. In Islamic mysticism, desires became deeply reputable as approach of divine steering. In the meantime, Christian monks and theologians started out cataloging goals of saints and martyrs, visions that regularly anticipated future miracles or divine justice. The same structure remained. Sleep as a portal to the sacred, dreams as veiled messages, and interpreters because the bridge between human and divine. Speedy forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and we meet Sigmund Freud, who, despite rejecting religious interpretations, borrowed closely from the symbolic shape pioneered millennia before. In the Interpretation of Desires 1899, Freud argued that desires expressed repressed dreams and fears, but he nonetheless used ancient equipment, metaphor, image, narrative. His protege Carl Junger went further, describing the dream international as populated by means of archetypes, general figures like the shadow, the hero, and the clever vintage guy, eerily just like figures one would possibly discover in a Greek temple or Babylonian omen list. Even modern neuroscience, while stripping dreams of their mysticism, nevertheless respects their complexity. REM sleep, lucid dreaming, and have an effect of trauma or memory on dream content. These thoughts echo historical notions that desires reflect both the health of the frame and the kingdom of the soul. Popular culture, too, incorporates on the torch. From movie and literature to tarot and New Age spirituality, goals continue to be a supply of fascination. Whether or not it is a horror movie primarily based on sleep paralysis, or a dream magazine app promising self-discovery, the historic idea nonetheless pulses underneath that what we see in sleep matters. Ultimately, the ancients might not have had brain scans or sleep labs. However, they understood something we still chase these days. Desires aren't random. They are testimonies, indicators, or shadows whispered within the language of gods, ancestors, or ourselves. The query stays the equal across time. What's your dream attempting to inform you? In the mid-9th century, the United States became a rustic stretching on the seams. Via 1860, California were a kingdom for a complete decade, but it regularly felt more like a distant cousin than a sibling. The Jap half of the U.S. buzzed with towns, telegraphs, and railroads, while the western frontier remained rugged, far-flung, and painfully disconnected. A letter from Big Apple to San Francisco ought to take 3 to 4 weeks, once in a while longer if storms, delays, or bandits were given in the way. And that's if it arrived at all. Mail routes on the time were as convoluted as they had been inefficient. The most not unusual path concerned ships wearing mail down the Atlantic throughout the Isthmus of Panama, then again up the Pacific coast, an adventure filled with delays, tropical sicknesses, and logistical nightmares. Meanwhile, the overland path via Degree Instruct was gradual, perilous, and often bogged down by means of muddy trails, snowbound passes, or attacks from outlaws and hostile terrain. This lag wasn't just an inconvenience. It turned into a political problem. The federal government involved that California, an increasing number of remoted, may glide away in spirit or loyalty. In an era wherein secession changed into already at the horizon, maintaining unity across the continent became not simply ideal, it was pressing. Entrepreneurs and visionaries started out floating formidable answers. None bolder than the concept of creating an imperative relay system, using the one issue the American West had in abundance: open land and rapid horses. If skilled riders could gallop across the us of a in shifts, swapping horses at stations every 10 to 15 m, perhaps, simply perhaps, they may cut delivery time from weeks to just 10 days. It become an insane inspiration. The course would be almost 2,000 m from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. It might cross mountains, deserts, rivers, and territories that had slightly been mapped. There could be excessive warmth, freezing nights, and the ever-present threat of ambush. However, if it worked, it might be the fastest communique line among East and West. The hassle become clean. The USA become increasing faster than its infrastructure. And so, with a mix of desperation, ambition, and natural frontier bold, a solution galloped into records, one saddle bag at a time. The Pony Express became about to be born. The Pony Explicit didn't just materialize out of the dirt. It became the brainchild of three bold businessmen from the freight and degree coach company Russell, Primary, and Weddell. Based in Missouri, the trio William H. Russell, Alexander Predominant, and William B. Weddell were already veterans within the overland shipping global. Their enterprise changed into accountable for hauling freight and government components across the wild frontier. But in 1860, they set their sights on a far more radical intention, speeding up mail transport to California inside the shortest time possible. At the time, Russell, in particular, was feeling the strain. His popularity turned into on the line due to monetary scandals and failed ventures. He saw the horse explicit no longer simply as a patriotic provider, but as a personal redemption arc, a manner to repair his name and benefit choose with the authorities. If they may prove their relay system labored, they was hopping to land a profitable federal mail agreement. Alexander Essential added the logistics mind. A religious and meticulous planner, he demanded subject from his employees, even requiring riders and station masters to swear oaths in opposition to drinking and cursing. He additionally developed an extraordinarily structured device for the specific. Stations could be constructed every 10 to 15 m, large domestic stations each 75 to 100 miles, and the complete direction would be maintained like an army operation. William B. Weddell, the quietest of the trio, supplied the felony and monetary backbone, while Russell became the salesman and most important the operational genius. Weddell kept the books and ensured the company stayed afloat, at the least for some time. Together, the three poured loads of thousands of bucks into the project. They offered over 400 horses, employed more than 80 riders, and built kind of 190 stations across the most far-flung parts of the frontier. They knew it changed into a big gamble, and they knew the direction would be grueling. However, additionally, they knew that whoever solved the communique crisis could earn an everlasting vicinity in American records. And so, with non-government funding, they launched the provider themselves. It became a bold flow, financially reckless, logistically insane, and yet deeply symbolic of American grit. In April of 1860, the Pony Express changed into prepared to trip. The race in opposition to time and terrain turned into on. Growing the horse explicit course changed into like building a delicate bridge across a continent without a protection net, and almost no margin for error. The entire distance spanned almost 2,000 m, stretching from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, through a dizzying array of landscapes, rolling plains, mountain levels, high deserts, and dangerous river crossings. To make this insane concept paintings, the founders built a chain of about 190 relay stations spaced every 10 to 15 miles. About the space a horse ought to journey at complete speed before tiring. Every 75 to 100 m, a domestic station supplied rest and safe haven for the riders, where they could sleep, eat, and hand off the mail to a sparkling rider. But the real backbone of the explicit changed into the horses, extra than 400 in all. They had been selected now not for looks or stature, but for sheer speed and stamina. In the east, fleet-o-footed thoroughbreds dominated the prairie. Within the rugged west, compact and hardy mustangs carried the mail throughout the mountains and wasteland. These were the Ferraris of the frontier. Riders could gallop at full velocity, jump off mid-stride, and jump onto a fresh mount in a count number of seconds. Every station needed to be manned, stocked, and cozy. Some were little extra than sod huts or timber shacks. Others have been fortified systems, surrounded via barbed fencing, and guarded by way of station keepers with rifles. Materials, water, feed, and food needed to be transported in advance. This intended months of preparation, and it all had to be executed in a number of the maximum far-flung, inhospitable land in the United States. Climate posed one of the biggest threats. Riders might bear snowstorms inside the Sierra Nevada, sandstorms within the Utah wasteland, and brutal summer season heat at the Nebraska plains. Wild animals, swollen rivers, and collapsing trails have been daily risks. And then there have been human risks. Bandits, outlaws, and the growing tensions of struggle with local American tribes. But despite the chaos, the machine worked. With riders swapping each 75-100 miles and sparkling horses each 10-15, the mail flew throughout the continent in as low as 10 days, an innovative pace on the time. It changed into a logistical miracle stitched together by means of braveness, sweat, and uncooked determination. In a land where miles supposed isolation, the Pony Explicit stitched together a delicate thread of connection, one hoofbeat at a time. On April 3, 1860, the Horse Pacific made its historical debut. In St. Joseph, Missouri, a crowd gathered at the stables of the Pike's Top Stables building, humming with pleasure. The inaugural rider, most likely Johnny Fry, although data are particularly disputed, installed his horse, took the leather mock, a in particular designed mail pouch, and dashed off westward at breakneck pace. The gang cheered, cannons fired, and similar to that, a brand new chapter in American records thundered to life. The mailbag Fry carried weighed around 20 lb, filled with letters, newspapers, and telegrams certain for California. A telegraph message had already been stressed from Washington, D.C., and would now tour the rest of the manor on horseback, symbolizing the union of era and raw human attempt. At the same second, a counterpart in Sacramento rode eastward, launching the directional relay. Between them stood almost 2,000 m of wilderness, 190 stations, and a number of the harshest terrain north the USA needed to provide, and that they deliberate to cross it in only 10 days. Every rider at the direction carried the mochila from one station to the next, leaping off a elvered horse and onto a sparkling one in below mins. The mochila was ingeniously designed. It had 4 locked pouches and will be fast slipped over the saddle horn without unstrapping something. Velocity become everything. Riders had been expected to preserve a pace of 10 mph, even inside the useless of night time through rain, snow, or adverse territory. Notwithstanding the chaos, the primary journey succeeded. The mail from Missouri reached Sacramento in 9 days and 23 hours. A triumph. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle of contemporary conversation, and the legend of the horse explicit was born nearly in a single day. Though only some letters rode in that first mock, the symbolic impact became massive. It wasn't pretty much getting mail from point A to B. It became approximately opportunity, about proving that this wild, fractured continent can be connected, that man and horse may want to outpace isolation. For the riders, it became the beginning of a risky, exciting chapter. For the kingdom, it turned into a taste of something new, immediately communication, faster than all people concept feasible. The West had just gotten a touch smaller. The lifeblood of the horse explicit wasn't the horses, the stations, or maybe the maquila. It became the riders, a band of young, wiry daredevils who defied climate, desolate tract, and warfare to deliver the mail. They weren't just couriers. They had been reciting legends within the making. The standard pony explicit rider changed into no older than 18, frequently toward 16. They have been mild, usually beneath 125 pounds, so as not to overwhelm the horses. Speed and staying power have been the entirety. The now famous recruitment advertisements allegedly read, "Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Have to be expert riders willing to threat loss of life daily. Orphans preferred." At the same time as the wording is in all likelihood apocryphal, the spirit in the back of it became sincerely actual. Those younger men rode 75 to 100 miles in line with shift, converting horses at every station, but never resting until they had surpassed the Machilla to the following rider. They often rode at night time via torrential rain, snowstorms, or scorching warmth. They carried revolvers and rifles, but in opposition to bandits or antagonistic attacks, their nice defense became speed. A lot of them traveled by myself, unarmed, relying absolutely on their capability to outrun problem. A few riders became people heroes. Pony Bob Haslam as soon as rode 380 m in below days to deliver mail all through a violent pute, uprising notwithstanding being wounded via arrows. William Buffalo Invoice Cody, who could later turn out to be a Wild West showman, claimed to have ridden for the explicit at age 15, although historians debate the accuracy of that tale. Regardless, the reality became already dramatic sufficient. Riders had to navigate the Rocky Mountains, go the outstanding Basin wasteland, and brave territories wherein the slightest mistake could suggest freezing, drowning, or vanishing without a hint. And yet, the service maintained a remarkable reliability charge. Even within the cruelest conditions, best one mula become ever lost. Notwithstanding the danger, many riders cherish the job. They have been paid properly for the time. $100 to $150 consistent with month, a small fortune for a teenager. and they relished the fun, the rate, and the experience of motive. They were not just using mail. They had been stitching the us of a collectively. The riders of the Horse Express have been more than messengers. They were symbols of Yankee courage, staying power and tenacity, galloping through delusion and memory with every hoofbeat. And for 18 unforgettable months, they proved that no frontier become too wide to pass. Using for the pony explicit wasn't just a task. It turned into a daily gamble with loss of life. The riders faced a gauntlet of perils that would have made maximum grown men turn lower back. But these ordinarily teenage boys pressed ahead through nature's wrath, armed enemies, and a land that often regarded decided to swallow them entire. One of the most chronic threats got here from the environment itself. Riders braved blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, blistering warmness across the Nevada barren region, and sudden thunderstorms that might flood river crossings or flip dust paths into not possible muck. Slipping off a horse in freezing conditions should mean hypothermia. One incorrect move in a swollen river ought to end in drowning, and plenty of came dangerously near. Then there have been the animals. Packs of wolves occasionally chased riders at night time. Rattlesnakes coiled in trailside brush, and mountain lions stalked the excessive passes. However, even more risky than wildlife had been the bandits and bushwhackers who knew that a rider's mochila contained precious letters, some even laced with gold dirt or money orders. Though the riders carried revolvers, they have been outnumbered. And preventing intended risking both lifestyles and challenge. Tensions with local American tribes additionally boiled over for the duration of the Pony Express's short life. The Pot War in 1860, sparked by way of grievances over land, damaged promises, and settler encroachment, caused numerous assaults on pony-specific stations. Riders were ambushed, station keepers were killed, and multiple stations have been burned to the floor. The maximum famous episode occurred while Pony Bob Haslam galloped nearly 190 m through antagonistic territory to carry the mail, struggling wounds from arrows, however finishing his direction regardless. Even isolation turned into a hazard. Riders were on my own, regularly for hours, with nothing but their horse, their weapon, and the looming dark. A damaged leg, an injured horse, or an overlooked station ought to imply dying on my own within the desert, never observed. And yet they rode. No matter all this, the system continued. Mail turned into delayed, but not often misplaced. Riders were once in a while wounded, however they almost always made it through. In 18 months of operation, most effective a handful of guys were killed at the process. The Horse Express wasn't a delusion of the Wild West. It became a brutal, often terrifying fact. However, in surviving those dangers, the riders became legends, proving that even the most unforgiving terrain will be tamed, if only for lengthy sufficient to deliver the mail. Although the pony-specific best operated for 18 months, its effect on America changed into quick, far-reaching, and undeniably profound. In a rustic teetering on the threshold of civil war and determined to sense unified throughout its vast landscape, the Express proved one component loud and clean. Distance became now not destiny. Earlier than the Horse Express, it took weeks for letters to journey from the East Coast to California. Essential political decisions, commercial deals, and private news regularly arrived too late to count. But with the explicit, mail could attain San Francisco in only 10 days. Californians were not out of sync with the relaxation of the United States of America. Businesses grew bolder. Newspapers may want to report close to actual-time updates from throughout the country. Families felt nearer. And most significantly, the Union felt more related, which could grow to be vital because the civil struggle loomed. Politically, the explicit also reassured the federal government that the West became inside attain. It symbolized national energy and brotherly love at a time, while fragmentation felt dangerously near. President James Buchanan obtained everyday updates from California in the course of the traumatic months leading up to Lincoln's election, in component way to the specific. Economically, it helped lay the foundation for transcontinental infrastructure. The stations built throughout far-off territory became future websites for railroads, telegraph strains, and level train routes. Many Pony Express routes would later be absorbed into more everlasting communique structures. What became as soon as a formidable gamble became the blueprint for how the US could join itself coast to coast. And culturally, the Horse Explicit have become the embodiment of frontier spirit. Newspapers romanticize the writers, developing instant heroes. Young men throughout the United States dreamed of taking the reins, galloping through threat with a saddle bag complete of destiny. The specific became mythologized even because it operated, taking pictures the imagination of a country hungry for symbols of courage and team spirit. Even after it ended, the Pony Specific persevered to shape American identity. It represented velocity, courage, sacrifice, and mainly possibility. In just over 12 months, it controlled to do what steamship, Congress, and diplomacy didn't do. Make a fractured, sprawling state sense like one. The Horse Specific failed to simply deliver mail. It delivered the destiny, one gallop at a time. For all its bold and triumph, the Horse Explicit became doomed from the start. It wasn't a rely of failure. It turned into a count of era. As speedy as a horse ought to journey, nothing should compete with the speed of a cord. Just 2 days after the Horse Specific officially launched in April 1860, creation started out on the transcontinental telegraph, a coast-to-coast conversation system that could transmit messages in minutes rather than days. The telegraph poles and features advanced gradually westward from the Missouri River and eastward from California. Every mile of cord spelled another nail inside the coffin of the explicit. With the aid of October 24th, 1861, simply 18 months after the primary ride, the final telegraph cord turned into strung throughout the United States of America. The device went stay, and the relationship changed into instantaneous. That very equal day, the Pony Express carried its last letter. The silence of hoof beats was changed by the rhythmic click of Morse code. But even before the telegraph, the horse-specific become bleeding money. No matter its mythical overall performance, it changed into an industrial disaster. Russell, Essential, and Weddell had poured greater than $700,000 into the operation and slightly recouped a fragment. Without a federal subsidy and excessive operational charges, horses, riders, station renovation, and deliver logistics, the specific become by no means a sustainable enterprise version. It become built as a evidence of idea, a formidable commercial for a mail contract that never fully came through. Russell himself faced monetary scandal, and the enterprise commenced to crumble. By the point the telegraph was completed, the Express become already on its remaining legs, heroic liked, but completely out of date. Yet the quit got here with little bitterness. The very intention the horse explicit set out to prove that rapid coast-to-coast conversation was feasible had been executed. Riders became to different frontier jobs. Stations have been repurposed or abandoned, and the kingdom grew to become its eyes to the destiny. The autumn of the Pony Specific become not a failure. It was a passing of the torch. The horse gave manner to the wire, just as the twine could later yield to radio, satellites, and the internet. However, for one brief, shining moment, the United States watched in awe as teenage boys and effective horses conquered time and distance. In an international enthusiastic about speed, the horse-specific galloped into legend and left hoof prints no telegraph wire could ever erase. Even though it lasted best 18 months, the Pony Explicit galloped immediately into the mythology of the American West, turning into one of the most enduring and romanticized tales inside the kingdom's history. In fact, it became a risky, brief-lived enterprise mission. But inside the public creativeness, it have become something a ways extra. A image of heroism, pace, and the relentless frontier spirit. Hollywood, dime novels, and school textbooks transformed the explicit into legend. The photograph of a lone rider silhouetted against the sundown, thundering throughout the prairie with a leather-based mail pouch and an unwell shooter at his aspect, captured the nation's heart. This wasn't simply nostalgia. It turned into country-wide identification in motion. At a time while America changed into nevertheless defining itself, the horse-specific provided a story of bravery, sacrifice, and cohesion via problem. Figures like Pony Bob Haslam and Buffalo Bill Cody became frontier celebrities. Cody, whether or not he rode for the explicit or no longer, capitalized at the legend in his Wild West shows, cementing the picture of the fearless teenage courier inside the minds of millions internationally. The explicit became shorthand for grit, daring, and the whole lot Americans wanted to consider approximately their pioneer beyond. Monuments soon observed. Statues of galloping riders now stand in cities throughout the vintage path, from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Highways and motorbike paths trace the unique course. Reenactments, museum reveals, and ancient excursions maintain the memory alive. Even the US postal provider has issued Pony Express stamps honoring the brief but formidable enterprise that helped unite the state. However, the story endures for a deeper cause. The Pony Express reminds country second in history, while human patience raced neck and neck with nature's obstacles. When verbal exchange intended danger and connection required braveness, it tells us that velocity as soon as got here not from satellites, however from sheer dedication and a willingness to experience through snow, desert, and darkness with nothing but a horse and a dream. In our age of instantaneous messages and global networks, it is easy to forget just how hard one communique as soon as became. The horse specific stands as a tribute to individuals who bridged impossible distances, now not with fiber optics or power, but with muscle, grit, and a pounding heartbeat. Its legend stays now not because it lasted, but due to the fact for a brief and shining moment, it outran the impossible. The earliest known beer did not are available a frosty mug or a classified bottle. It came in a clay pot inside the middle of a Sumerian village lots of years in the past. Lengthy before Rome rose or pyramids stood, the human beings of historic Mesopotamia, particularly the Sumerians, were brewing beer in methods each simple and sacred, and that they were not simply consuming it. They have been worshiping it. Beer in Sumerian society wasn't only an informal beverage. It turned into a staple food, a shape of foreign money, a non-secular supplying, and an image of civilization. It is no coincidence that the oldest written recipe in human history isn't always for bread or soup, however for beer. Located on clay pills relationship again to around 1800 B. CE. The hymn to Ninkasi praises the goddess of beer at the same time as simultaneously laying out brewing commands in verse. Ninkasi wasn't a minor deity. She became respected. To brew beer changed into to invoke her presence. The brewing manner become both practical and poetic. Sumerians could bake a unique bread referred to as bapier fabricated from barley and regularly blended with honey or dates. This bread was then crumbled into jars of water and left to ferment certainly. The end result wasn't whatever like modern-day beer. It became thick, cloudy, and occasional in alcohol, extra like a nutritious GRL. And it become crucial to each day lifestyles. Water within the historic world became often contaminated. However, beer, way to its fermentation process, changed into more secure. It turned into rich in calories and nutrients, and it became a part of the weight reduction plan for workers, monks, and royalty alike. People on temple projects or irrigation ditches had been regularly paid in beer rations that can quantity to several liters a day. Socially, beer changed into a communal revel-in. As opposed to consuming from mugs, human beings frequently gathered around huge ceramic vessels and drank through long reed straws, filtering out the sediment. It wasn't just about getting drunk. It became about bonding, surviving, or even honoring the gods. In lots of approaches, beer helped define what it meant to be Sumerian. It was embedded in rituals, regulation codes, agriculture, and economics. It changed into liquid civilization, both a day-by-day necessity and a sacred act. And it set the stage for brewing cultures across the historical world. From the banks of the Tigris to the seashores of the Nile. If the Sumerians gave beer its spiritual starting, the Egyptians industrialized it. By the point the old nation changed into growing alongside the Nile, beer had come to be extra than a sacred drink. It changed into a pillar of Egyptian society, woven into the whole lot from day-by-day food to divine services and funeral rites. Egyptian beer became brewed on a scale that dwarfed in advanced techniques. At large temples and palace complexes, huge breweries operated as part of the kingdom financial system. In reality, beer production turned into often overseen via religious establishments. The Egyptians believed beer was a gift from Osiris, god of agriculture and fertility, and it featured prominently in ceremonies honoring deities inclusive of Hathor, the goddess of tune, fertility, and joy, often related to intoxication and revelry. The brewing system becomes similar to that of the Sumerians, however had evolved in each method and scale. Bread crafted from wheat or barley become partially baked, crumbled into massive vats and combined with water. Dates or honey were added for sweetness, and the combination become left to ferment in ceramic jars. The ensuing beverage turned into thick, unfiltered, and highly nutritious. Every now and then fed on with a spoon instead of sipped. Beer wasn't only for the dwelling. Tombs have been stocked with jars of beer for the afterlife, along loaves of bread and meat. Beer became taken into consideration, so critical that no first-rate journey to the next world can be imagined without it. Recipes for the lifeless, lists of beer services to the gods, and work of art showing the brewing process all highlight its non-secular weight. But beer additionally fueled the labor economic system. Workers who constructed the pyramids were not slaves. They had been paid employees, and a part of their daily rations protected beer, every now and then as much as 4 lurs an afternoon. This wasn't an indulgence. It was hydration, nutrition, and morale al-anon. One archaeologist even referred to as it the historical Egyptian power drink. The nation maintained strict control over production and distribution. Taxes were levied in beer, and its best become regulated. Ladies, in particular priestesses and temple workers, had been regularly involved in brewing, reinforcing its connection to each domestic lifestyles and sacred electricity. In brief, beer in Egypt wasn't a facet word. It became primary. It nourished the humans, pleased the gods, and crammed the tombs. And just like the Nile itself, it flowed through each part of Egyptian life. Across historic civilizations, beer wasn't only a drink. It became divine communion. Its frothy presence changed into invited into temples, funerals, and festivals. Fermentation became now not seen as a chemical process, but as a magical transformation, a gift from the gods that turned simple grain into sacred liquid. To brew beer changed into to engage with the non-secular world, and to drink it turned into to partake in something extra than sustenance. In Suma, the goddess Nicarasi embodied this connection. Her hymn became each prayer and training, an act of devotion and a guide for sacred brewing. Rituals in all likelihood started out with chants to invoke her presence before fermenting started out. It's feasible that the final beer changed into shared as part of temple offerings, given to priests, and even poured out in libation to the gods themselves. In Egypt, the religious use of beer became woven even deeper into the non-secular fabric. Temples brewed their very own beer for each day services, sometimes dedicating loads of jars right away. All through the yearly pageant of drunkenness, worshippers celebrated the myth of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction who became tricked into drinking beer dyed pink to resemble blood. The end result, her bloodlust became sedated, and humanity changed into stored. It is an effective story of how beer became actually visible as a pressure that could tame divine wrath. Monks and priestesses performed energetic roles within the brewing technique, and many religious texts cited unique ritual brews meant for ceremonies. The presence of beer in horary rites changed into also key. It became believed to preserve the soul on its adventure to the afterlife. A few tomb inscriptions even list particular beer offerings along prayers and hymns. Out of doors, the temples, seasonal festivals frequently involved large-scale communal consuming. Those were now not casual events. They have been acts of connection among the human and divine realms. Whether or not celebrating a harvest, honoring the dead, or marking a solstice, beer helped blur the line among the mundane and the mystical. Even in later cultures like the Hebrews or the Hittites, beer retained religious undertones. Whilst wine received favor in elite rituals, beer remained tied to fertility, the earth, and the operating elegance, maintaining its historical role as a sacred and grounding force. Within the historic world, ingesting beer wasn't pretty much thirst. It became approximately aligning yourself with cosmic rhythms, with gods, nature, and the cycle of existence and demise. Beer wasn't only a product of civilization. It could were a cause of it. Some historians and archaeologists now argue that the preference to brew beer was one of the driving forces in the back of early agriculture and agreement. At the same time as grain was honestly grown for bread, the opportunity that humans started cultivating cereals and component to make beer is gaining growing scholarly guide. If true, beer isn't always only a byproduct of civilization. It's certainly one of its founding pillars. In historic Mesopotamia, wherein prepared farming first took root, evidence shows that barley, one of the earliest domesticated grains, turned into prized not only for food, however, for its fermentable sugars. As soon as harvested, barley will be stored, ground, and utilized in each bread and beer manufacturing. And not like water, which become frequently polluted, fermented beer turned into safe to drink and could be stored longer. This made it crucial for early communities, mainly in arid or semi-arid regions in which water components had been unreliable. Beer manufacturing also necessitated a degree of social employer. Brewing required gear, garage vessels, controlled temperatures, and unique timing. This encouraged department of exertions, technological innovation, or even early science. Clay capsules display that ancient brewers understood fermentation procedures well sufficient to replicate them continuously. No small feat in an age without thermometers or yeast packets. In urban facilities like Uruk and Babylon, breweries became a part of state and temple economies. Rations of beer were distributed to employees, squatties, and bureaucrats. Taxes could be levied in grain or beer. And because beer turned into tied to each the economic system and faith, its manufacturing turned into intently monitored and controlled. This intended that brewing contributed to the upward push of paperwork, recordkeeping, and standardized weights and measures. Beer became also instrumental within the increase of trade networks. Regions with surplus grain and brewing, understanding exchanged beer, components, and brewing tools with neighboring cultures. Pottery jars filled with fermented drinks were discovered in Levantine and Egyptian change sites, suggesting beer became a commodity really worth transporting. In brief, beer helped people settle, arrange, and thrive. It fueled employees, linked towns, supported rituals, and justified grain cultivation. The frothy beverage was far greater than a deal with. It became liquid infrastructure, building the inspiration of the ancient world sip through sip. Lengthy earlier than breweries had been industrialized or recipes have been written down, beer was the area of girls. In lots of historic cultures, brewing become now not a male-dominated career, but a household artwork practiced nearly completely by way of ladies. And some distance from being a humble kitchen chore, brewing turned into visible as a sacred and skilled craft passed from mom to daughter like an heirloom recipe. In Sumerian society, beer changed into so entwined with femininity that even the goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, changed into girl. This wasn't symbolic. It reflected the fact that Sumerian women had been the principal brewers in each home and temple contexts. Brewing and baking were often achieved facet by facet, and within the early days, both concerned fermentation. While guys oversaw politics and change, ladies made the foods and drinks that sustained the family and society. In Egypt, girls persevered to dominate brewing, mainly within the home. Beer turned into brewed in clay vessels, the usage of gently baked loaves of grain, water, and flavorings. The method became exertions extensive, but routine. Many girls brewed every day or weekly, not just for own family consumption, however for sale or alternate in neighborhood markets. In wealthier families, Girl servants or workers controlled small cow breweries. Tomb artwork and hieroglyphs often depict women brewing, straining, and storing beer, highlighting their crucial function in this key part of life. Women have been also closely worried in brewing for temples and rituals. Priestesses and temple people regularly oversaw sacred batches meant for offerings or non-secular galas. In a few areas, being a brewer was a source of social repute and religious have an effect on. Those women were not just cooks. They have been custodians of divine lifestyle. Over the years, as societies grew more stratified and beer became commercialized, guys began to dominate public brewing. However, inside the earliest chapters of beer's history, women held the reins. They evolved the methods, controlled the components, and safeguarded the understanding. Apparently, echoes of this way of life survived into the medieval duration. In Europe, many early brewers had been alewives, ladies who made and offered ale from their houses. A few wore tall hats to be visible inside the marketplace, an element that could later be twisted into the stereotypical picture of a witch. But inside the historic world, a female with a brew pot wasn't suspicious. She became respected. She nourished gods and mortals alike, one effervescent jar at a time. Ancient brewing wasn't simply luck and magic. It turned into a craft refined over generations, mixing observation, experimentation, and environmental know-how. While each culture had its own versions, the center ideas of brewing were especially consistent. Grain, water, fermentation, and time. But the specifics, that is in which it gets fascinating. The number one grain used throughout plenty of the ancient international turned into barley, though Emma wheat turned into also not unusual, in particular in Egypt. These grains have been selected now not simplest for his or her availability, but due to the fact they evidently contain the sugars and enzymes essential for fermentation. Grains have been normally partially malted, soaked in water, and allowed to germinate barely, then either ground into mash or baked into loaves of bread specially supposed for brewing. In both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions, those bread loaves, regularly called papier in Sumer, have been crumbled into huge ceramic vats full of water. The combination turned into stirred, every now and then boiled, after which left to ferment. Natural yeast from the air, or from the vessels themselves, triggered the fermentation system. No person knew what yeast changed into, but they knew it worked, and that certain vessels made higher beer, probably due to the fact they housed residual yeast colonies. To sweeten or taste the beer, brewers brought dates, honey, herbs, or spices. Egyptian beer in particular become often thick and candy, almost like a liquid porridge. Filtering turned into non-compulsory. Some versions had been ate up with straws to avoid sediment. Others have been so nutritious that beer became taken into consideration a meal in itself, mainly for people and the poor. Temperature played a key position. In warm climates like Egypt and Mesopotamia, brewers timed their paintings cautiously and used cool storage pits or shaded courtyards to control the surroundings. In a few instances, beer changed into elderly in sealed clay jars. At the same time as in others, it turned into meant to be consumed fresh. Brewing gear blanketed massive clay vessels, timber paddles, woven saves, and occasionally stone hearths for heating. The entirety was made by hand, and every batch was slightly distinctive. However, the information became surpassed down orally or ritually, preserved through repetition, music, and prayer, like the hymn to Ninkasi. Some distance from primitive, historic brewing strategies had been sophisticated variations to neighborhood climates, grains, and cultural choices. They replicate not just culinary ability, however, an intimate courting with nature, time, and transformation, a type of alchemy where grain and water became a sacred social elixir. As beer have become valuable to daily existence, its role accelerated some distance beyond the household or temple. In many historical civilizations, beer turned into now not just a beverage. It became currency, commodity, and financial engine. From workers' wages to kingdom taxes, beer changed into woven without delay into the material of historical commerce. In Mesopotamia, beer was a key component of the ration gadget. People, consisting of builders, farmers, and even scribes, obtained each day portions of beer as a part of their widespread pay. The quantity, and best numerous through rank. Better officers acquired greater subtle beer at the same time as workers got thicker, coarser sorts. Detailed, ununiform tablets listing these allocations and thousands of historic receipts display beer transactions. Proof that it changed into as important as silver or grain within the monetary environment. Beer manufacturing itself have become an expert alternate. Breweries regularly connected to temples or estates required a small army of employees, grain creditors, millers, bakers, fermenters, and transporters. Some regions specialized in beer production, growing regional patterns, and organizing localized trade routes. These beers weren't bottled and shipped as today. However, they might be moved in ceramic jars sealed with wax or fabric. Traders bartered beer for other goods like wool, pottery, and olive oil. In Egypt, the photo turned into comparable. Beer become produced on a full-size scale in both city facilities and rural estates. Breweries were often connected to nation granaries, and their output supported people, squatties, and temple sports. Beer turned into taxed, tracked, and stockpiled like every strategic useful resource. In tough times, beer even became a bartering tool in place of scarce currency. Beer additionally performed a function in lengthy distance exchange. Clay vessels with residues of barley-based totally brews had been found as some distance aside as the Levant, Cyprus, and Nubia, suggesting that fermented liquids were exchanged along luxurious gadgets. At the same time as wine would ultimately dominate elite markets, beer remained the people's drink, embedded in every transaction from village markets to temple distributions. Its portability and perishability made beer a uniquely nearby economic product, however one with countrywide significance. Its production supported farmers, artisans, traders, and monks alike. It became both each-day sustenance and nation infrastructure. In short, ancient beer wasn't just fed on. It became counted, traded, stored, and spent. It helped build pyramids, fund temples, and preserve empires. A mug of beer may additionally have cost a few copper coins. However, behind it stood a microcosm of civilization. In the historic global, beer was the top-notch equalizer. Anybody drank it. However, now not each person drank the same type. Just as with food, apparel, and language, beer pondered and bolstered the inflexible social hierarchies of the time. While commoners sipped thick, hearty brews for survival, the elites grew to become beer into a standing image, a ritual supplying, and sometimes even a political tool. A few of the Sumerians and Adians, employees have been issued everyday beer rations. Their brews had been darkish, unfiltered, and dense, extra stew than drink but fantastically nourishing. These were purposeful beers, intended to preserve employees in warm, arid conditions. Yet even here, there has been version. A few drugs point out at least 9 distinct varieties of beer, ranked through high quality and cause. The better versions have been often reserved for scribes, clergymen, or administrators, showing that beer changed into already getting used to draw magnificent lines. In Egypt, the assessment became even starker. At the same time as everyday Egyptians drank a thick beer crafted from emma wheat and flavored with dates, the wealthy enjoyed refined brews, lighter, sweeter, and on occasion filtered. Tomb artwork depict nobles with goblets of golden beer, seated underneath palm fronds, even as servants poured from fashionable jars. For the upper lessons, beer became no longer just sustenance. It was a cultured revel-in. Pharaohs and their households received beer offerings each day, often alongside wine and bread. These libations weren't mere lifestyle. They reflected power. Handiest the wealthy ought to find the money for committed brewing personnel, get admission to the finest elements, and the amusement to enjoy beer recreationally in preference to depend upon it for calories. Beer also served diplomatic and ceremonial capabilities throughout feasts, treaties, or spiritual fairs. Imparting beer of high nice signaled wealth and recognize. Not offering beer that could be seen as an insult. Curiously, the brewing career itself mirrored this divide. In houses and villages, ladies or slaves commonly brewed the own family's supply. But in temples or elite households, expert brewers, once in a while skilled and salaried, dealt with manufacturing. The beer that flowed from temple vats turned into better regulated, better taxed, and more politically big. So at the same time as beer changed into popular, its taste, texture, and which means numerous wildly depending on who you had been. For a few it became daily gas. For others it became an expression of divinity, wealth, and refinement. In every jar, ancient beer carried now not just taste, however a quiet signature of social fame, foaming at the rim. Even though hundreds of years have surpassed when you consider that Sumerian priestesses chanted to Ninkasi or Egyptian workers sipped beer underneath pyramid shadows, the legacy of historical brewing nevertheless lives on in our recipes, rituals, economies, and cultural reminiscence. Beer, perhaps greater than some other beverage, connects us to the earliest expressions of civilization. Cutting-edge brewing owes a first-rate debt to the historical international. Many techniques we take for granted these days, malting grain, fermenting with wild yeast, flavoring with herbs or fruit, were pioneered via brewers without a microscopes or thermometers. As an alternative, they relied on instinct, culture, and trial and error, guided by using oral wisdom and non-secular reverence. These techniques formed the foundation of what could ultimately come to be scientific brewing in later eras. The historic mindset in the direction of beer additionally lingers in cultural traditions. In locations like Ethiopia, Peru, and rural Jap Europe, groups nevertheless brew beer in ceramic vessels. Frequently, the use of age-antique recipes surpassed down through households. Echoes of Sumerian and Egyptian kitchens. In those locations, brewing isn't just a hobby or business. It's a ritual of network, simply because it turned into 5000 years in the past. The symbolic energy of beer has also continued. Fairs, vacations, and social gatherings around the arena nonetheless function beer as a crucial providing, a drink of birthday celebration, bonding, and identification. Even the communal pint at the pub carries the identical spirit because the historical Sumerian clay pot shared via reed straws, beer as a bridge among people. Academically, the take a look at of ancient brewing has sparked a developing area called bioarchaeology. The use of residue analysis. Scientists have reconstructed historic beer recipes, brewed them, or even bought them commercially. Experimental archaeology projects have correctly brewed beer from ancient Egyptian tomb recipes, supplying modern people a literal taste of history. Perhaps most significantly, historic beer reminds us that civilization wasn't simply built on conquest, stone, or metallic. It became additionally constructed in kitchens and breweries, by means of regular people who became grain and water into sustenance, economy, and culture. It changed into made via girls, fed on via employees, and supplied to gods. So the subsequent time you increase a pitcher, consider you're now not simply ingesting a beverage. You are participating in one of humanity's oldest and most well-known rituals. A legacy brewed over millennia and still fermenting in each nook of the arena.